here, and it'll be tuia. Tuia ke runga, tuia ke lalo, tuia ke waho, tuia ke roto, tuia ki te hele tangata, karongo te po, karongo te ao, omie, huie, tai ki e. All right, welcome everybody. Pleasure to have you with us again today. This is the fourth collective conversation that has run over the last 4 weeks, and what a real pleasure it is, obviously, to be back down to level 2 and pretty much a week into that. A couple of Zoom rules. Today, if we could please just make sure that we're on mute, and if you have a question, we have 2 options for you. One is to email, but actually the preferred is just to type your question into the chat function, and we should be able to surface that up and bring it forward for our speakers today to respond to. So with us really being in this little return to play phase, multiple codes have been back in action over the weekend and more so through this week and into next weekend, with college sport also getting back to the fray. Today we're really focused on the future of sport and recreation, and obviously this topic has very different meanings for all of you, all of us, as across the audience we traverse the full physical activity spectrum. And so as diverse and varied as we are, through the perspectives of our speakers, we're really looking to seed a little bit of thought, provoke a little bit of thinking, and direct your attention towards the future. And this little, second moment of crisis, probably given us the realisation that that sport and the world is certainly changing, but with that is also physical activity. And so if 2020 doesn't seem like it was an anomaly, it's sort of the new normal. Today, really fortunate to have some speakers with us that have quite an extensive background in the sport and recreation space. A little bit later, Phil Gibbons, CEO of Nukuora, and Andrew Leslie, Chief Executive of Recreation Aotearoa. But to start with, Raylene Castle, Chief Executive of Sport NZ, and certainly the leader in our field. Raylene has extensive experience as a sport administrator at all levels and contexts, and I'm sure has faced some substantive pressures and challenges that she's needed to respond to in her time. So Raylene, pleasure to hand it over to you to share us through this topic and your thoughts.
Thanks, Matt. Kia ora tātou. It's great to be here, and thank you, Phil, for the invite to be part of today. It's great to see everyone, well, I can't actually see everyone, but it's great to bring everyone together. And I think if there's one thing that COVID has done, it certainly made us good at Teams calls, but it has actually made us good at stepping in and thinking about how we can have these conversations that are valuable and that we can think slightly differently about them. And I think, hopefully it's also gives us a little bit more time in our day to reflect. And unlike you Wellingtonians are in level 2, and I hope you've enjoyed your cafe breakfast and your cup of coffee from the local barista this morning. Us Aucklanders are still in lockdown, and that creates some challenges. Obviously, it creates some challenges for one, the messaging that Sport New Zealand has a responsibility to try and deliver, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and also how the long-term effect of lockdown has versus short-term effects, and I can talk a little bit about that. So people might wonder what our role is in relation, Sport New Zealand's role when we go into a lockdown. And the answer to that is we have a policy mechanism as a Crown entity, and that policy mechanism, part of our organisation, is responsible for trying to translate what comes out of government and put it into a health and well-being appropriate type language for our sector, because there are some very generic things that they actually the government releases when they decide to reduce alert levels. And the thing that was different this time was that actually they changed in level 3 previously. We all remember there was things in level 3 that we were allowed to do. This time they took all of those things off the table. So they basically said, level 3, you can go from 4 to 3, but none of the exemptions that you had previously stand. You have to reapply for all of those things. So if you think about golf and greens and mowing golf courses, for example, we had to go back into bat with Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to try and actually get that approved, so that that was something that could be done inside COVID environments. So that's the type of example of the things that we do. We get lots of different requests from lots of people. Can we go fishing? How can we use indoor swimming pools? Can we use gymnasiums? All of those things. We have to try and take all that information, pick out the things that are most critical that don't or not supported by the advice from government, and then go to Department, Prime Minister and Cabinet and try and get those things supported, because we know that they're really important to people inside the sector. So sometimes when on our website, which hopefully you've all been and had a look at, where we have the specifics of a level alert level description in relation to context of the sport and recreation sector. That might take us a little while. That's because we're going back and forth negotiating to make sure that we can get clarity and give that to you as clearly as possible so that you can understand. And I know this time there's a couple of really significant challenges for everyone. One is obviously, even at level 2, is the use of indoor facilities, and how each of those indoor facilities have to have their own permanent walls and their own air conditioning vents or airflow capability. And I know that creates some problems for people. Also, the fact that organisations have to be responsible for collecting data about who's actually attended, so that we've got a record, whether it's QR coding or the like. If it's not QR coding, it's manually making sure that we're taking a record of who's attending our events. And then also, what does an outdoor event look like, and how many people can we have in different zones? So it is different. I urge you to go and have a look. And I noticed that Megan, I think, just popped it in the chat there, the specifics of the guidelines. So thank you very much for that. What do we know about lockdowns? Well, we know that when people are in lockdowns, for a short period of time, they do tend to get more active, walking, yoga, Les Mills online classes, or whatever other gym online classes you do. But over a period of time, that stops quite quickly. And we've actually seen physical activity deteriorate. So the percentages post-lockdown, when people go back and get really busy, they don't have the opportunity necessary to exercise like they were previously. So for us, there's a real focus on trying to, particularly in the rangatahi space, is making sure that they have the opportunity to get back out there, because we found in our research that they get hit the hardest. So I know there's a real challenge of season transition at the moment, that transition between winter sport finishing and summer sport starting. Some winter sports were really at the end of their season, and they they might have had to miss some final games, where, for example, in Auckland, we've got Northern Football that were only 60% through their season. So it is challenging as we sort of transition from summer to winter, winter to summer sport rather. And so anything that you can do as organisations on this call, and to think pragmatically and put the children or the rangatahi at the centre of those discussions, and make sure that they get the best experiences of trying to either finish a season or start a season, and have clear guidelines or stop and start between those two, so that they can finish winter sport and start summer sport, would be really important. During last lockdown, we saw some amazing engagement with our different sports. So they were negotiating seasons, beginnings and ends. But once we got out of COVID back into normal life, the scope creep started to happen again. And we saw people back fighting and making young people have to choose what sport they were going to have to play and finish off. So anything we can do in that space, we'd greatly appreciate your support. What from previous experience, the question is, what from previous experience at Sport NZ and in my NSO time? One is, any time that people feel uncertain, the thing that they like the most is certainty. So being able to give them that opportunity to get back into their environments as quickly as possible and do the things in their routine that they like the most is really helpful, and giving them some flexibility if possible around fees and payments, because we know for some people during lockdown this is an incredibly stressful time of not having income coming in. So anything sports can do to give leniency to that level of participation and not making fees the centre of that conversation, I think would be an incredibly helpful and beneficial thing that we could do for everybody. So what does the future of sport, recreation and play, active rec, look like? Well, I think on the one hand, there's a few really strategic pieces of work that Sport NZ have been doing around the future of sport and what does a preferred future look like, and that's all very nice and strategic, and things like what are we thinking about the effects on the environment, what about our bicultural strategy to ensure that we're focusing on the obligations to Te Tiriti. So those types of things are important. How can we work more effectively together, and how can we think about collaborating so that we're using resources effectively? Those are the types of things that people want to see as a sector came out of that work, and we've got 5 PO which are at our website if you're interested in having a look at that. But I think more practically is the evolution and the change of how young people want to engage. And whilst the reality is sport plays an incredibly important role, and we've just spent the last 6 weeks basking in the glory of great performances at Olympics and then into Paralympics, and that's been amazing from the opportunity to inspire young people and older people as well to get out and try different sports that perhaps they hadn't otherwise tried before. And that does give some of our participation numbers a boost. The reality is that our young people are looking for flexibility. So they want to be able to play the sport or actively recreate or play in a way that's relevant to them. They don't necessarily want to sign up to 26 weeks of competition. They want to play with their mates. They want it to be fun. They don't want it to be like a coach standing on the sideline yelling and screaming at them like they're playing for a world championship. Because the reality is, for most of us, we're never going to play or travel to an Olympics, but what we want is a lifetime of engagement and association with our sport and our friends and our colleagues and the things that we enjoy doing sport for. So things I've mentioned there are really what Balance is Better is all about, and that's a strategy and a plan that Sport New Zealand has, that our RST network and many of our NSOs have signed up for. And it's about making sure that we focus on skill development and fun as opposed to winning, and that we let people play in teams that they want to play with, and allow people choice to play a number of different sports as opposed to asking them to specialise too early. So those are the things that I think are really important about the future, is making sure that we are moving and listening to our customers around what do they want and how do they want to engage, because it's those things that ultimately will keep our young people and in our sports and in our active recreation organisations, and be it surfing or parkour or golf or the different ways that young people want to engage. It's because it's fun, and the fact that it's good for their health and being active is beneficial actually becomes a sideline because they just enjoy getting out there and sharing fun with their mates. So Matt, I think that's enough from me. Hopefully that gives people a little bit of background and context, and I'm really happy to take any questions if people have got them, and Colin's on, and if I can't answer anything now, I'm certainly happy to take it off record, and Colin can help me come back with some feedback.
No, great, Raylene, thank you for that. I just have a couple of questions to start things off, and realise the position you're in, so nothing sort of untoward policy-wise, but just general thinking. Amongst some of the local collective of RSO CEs, we've just been considering what some of the pressures that are forming and what's happening in the environment. So take inflation, for example, take also just increasing costs for RSOs, and we see this increased uncertainty that what providers of sport or an experience are offering may not be able to eventuate. And so we're concerned for just the future of sport and the nature of it. And I wonder what your thoughts or suggestions are to organisations around the product or service that they're offering, and what thoughts you might give them to consider more.
Yeah, well, I think, affordability is always really important, isn't it? And that's where we know that is a barrier to sport. And so, Sport New Zealand has released a couple of funds which allow young people, particularly in areas of high need or deprivation, to actually have some of their fees or shoes or uniforms actually covered. But I think at a more practical level is more what I said before, Matt, is thinking about what those young people are looking. So if we want our numbers to stay strong and we want people to engage, asking them to sign up to a 26-week season or maybe more like a 14 or 16-week season, have to have a coach, have to have a manager, have to supply a referee, have to go through a selection process, not allowing them to come together and play at the grade and levels that they want to play at. So more flexibility. I describe it like the indoor cricket, indoor netball model, where you get a group of people, you turn up, if you can play this week, you can play. If you can't play the following week. That is the type of flexibility that the research is telling us that's what people are looking for. So more play per game, as opposed to perhaps having to play pay for a whole season when I've got some complications of work or relationships or other things that I might want to fit in. So, there's certainly been some work done with our Sport D team and sport development team, and I know that we're happy to connect up with those guys if you want to have more on this conversation.
Yeah, that's great, Raylene, because I guess, so sitting in the middle between what's the demand side wanting, and you've explained that really well, is the constraints that are starting to form on the supply side. So just the increased compliance around the new conditions for level 2, for example, the resourcing that's required around that, even just communications, but also the planning for contingencies. And so if events and competitions can't go ahead, there's still a cost to RSOs and organisations, and so the likely cost, we think, to the participant is potentially going to increase, and you just explained really well that rangatahi aren't wanting to sign up for, say, 26 weeks of competition. It does potentially really change the landscape and the model for, say, an RSO, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, this is a really big conversation and we could spend a whole hour talking about this, right? But actually, sports working together more closely, sharing people so that they can work across summer and winter sports, being more thought-provoking about facility use. And that's certainly a real driver from a Sport New Zealand point of view, working with Education Department around trying to have any new facilities built across New Zealand be community and education partnered, so that they can actually be multi-use facilities and they can have entries, not literally, but on one side for the school to use during the week and the other side for community to use during the week. Or during the weekend rather, and at night time. So, some of that facility growth, use and sensible strategic planning is really important in how we think about and go about these things. And also, we all don't have to have our own toys, right? And as much as we've been proud of the fact that we've all got rugby, cricket and netball have all got our own development officers and all of those types of things, actually thinking about how we could have someone that works across those two sports and sharing resources might be the reality of what we're dealing with. And we know there's been some initial conversations about that, and anything Sport New Zealand can do to try and help facilitate those discussions, we're really happy to help.
Raylene, that's great. There's 2 or 3 things there that you've just seeded in that are new and potentially quite challenging concepts for organisations to get their head around. But the sharing of resources, going quite literally, sharing the people resources one. Brilliant. Hey, look, Raylene, we know that you need to leave pretty soon, so appreciate your contribution, really is appreciated, and thanks once again.
No problem. Thanks, guys. Enjoy the rest of your session. Appreciate it. Thanks, Phil. Kia ora.
Okay, so Next speaker today, Andrew Leslie, Chief Executive of Recreation Aotearoa. I suspect he's been CE there for about 9 years, maybe a little bit more. Andrew, great to have you with us. Looking forward to your view on just the changing world that we're in and what it means for recreation and your views.
Kia ora, Matt. Can you hear me all right?
You really well.
Excellent. Yeah, well, it's actually coming up 10 years. Been in the role as Chief Executive of Recreation Aotearoa. So just for those of you on the line that don't know us, we are the professional association, the peak body for the recreation industry. And by recreation, I guess what I mean is for activity that is unstructured, informal, non-competitive. So you sort of tend to see recreation described as being sort of different from sport, I guess. But probably it's, if you think about it more in terms of the sort of informal, unstructured realm, is probably a bit more helpful. And so our role as an association, we provide professional development, we help to set standards, and we provide advocacy on behalf of our members as well. So we're based here in Wellington, but we've got members right throughout the country, a lot of local authorities, regional sports trusts, and then a whole range of different activity providers, from sort of community-based right through to the outdoors. So yeah, I guess across my 10 years, I've seen a lot of change, but you know, and in a way, the things that you know, very topical now, it's like we're kind of living in the future already, in my view. You know, Raylene referred to the futures work that Sporting NZ have been doing, which within across the, I think it was 5 PO, you know, there's some big meaty areas like equity and inequality, like environmental management, operating under the principles of Te Tiriti. Well, we certainly see that's the environmental, that's the context within which a lot of us are working right here and now. And add into that now with COVID, and you know, God forbid if you know, our future is going to be filled with more and more pandemics. You know, that's it's very much, this is I think a window into what our future is going to be like. You know, so taking sort of recreation in that context, I guess the you know, the trend for quite some time has been physio activity sort of moving away from organised forms of activity to things that would fit into that realm of recreation. You know, think about walking, biking, swimming, those sorts of activities are always the most popular activities when New Zealanders are asked through the Active New Zealand survey. So there's always been a lot of participation within recreational activities. But as with sport, you know, we're seeing constraints very much so, and you know, Raylene referred to the overall sort of impact of physio activity coming out of COVID. Absolutely, that, you know, that applies to recreation as well. You know, think of what's happening right here and now with level 2 restrictions. Indoor facilities are limited in terms of number of people being able to come through the door, the number of groups they're able to cater for at any one time. Yeah, think about gyms as well. I mean, it's great as a user, I have to say. It's quite nice going to the gym where only sort of half the people that would normally be there are there, or if you're lucky to be able to book a swimming lane, you know, you got heaps of room, don't you? So that's nice, but it's not economically viable, that's for sure, for facility providers, for gym operators, etc. So how long that could be sustained is definitely a question, and I think, you know, the conversation before around what that means in terms of the cost of participating applies to recreation as well. You know, at some point, when will that cost be passed on to the participant? Is an interesting question. The other kind of area that's really constraining recreation at the moment is climate change, and we tend to talk about climate change as the future. but it's absolutely something that's happening and impacting right here and now. And there's a couple of main sort of areas where it's really visible. First area will be in and around extreme weather events. And you think about storms, you think about drought, and the impact that has on recreational infrastructure. So take the the damage that occurs to tracks, for example, what it does in terms of water shortages and being able to irrigate parks and so on. So that's something that's a right here and now issue that is actually limiting the opportunity to recreate. And then something that's kind of we're just starting to see the impacts of now, which will become more dramatic in the future, is the impact in coastal areas, not only in terms of the storm events, but also in terms of rising sea levels. And you sort of project that forward a few decades into the future, and you think, well, a city like Wellington is potentially going to need to retreat. And where is the space to retreat to? Well, there's going to be a whole heap of pressure then come on to our green space. It's quite literally the only available space for the city to retreat into. And then you kind of think about the impacts of access to places and spaces to recreate becomes pretty daunting, really, as well. So, I see the effects of that right here and now, but it's also something to be extremely wary of into the future as well. So yeah, a couple of things off the top of my head there, Matt. It's both a future view, but a here and now view, really, as well.
Yeah, Andrew, really interesting perspective. So a couple of statements you made there that really land. I think people probably accept that we are living in the future. It's the kind of stuff that's been happening that we probably never hoped for. Pandemics and the extreme cases of climate change. But I just want to draw your attention to one point that Raylene made, and that was the observation or the evidence that during lockdown people are increasing their physical activity levels straight away, but then they decline. And post-lockdown, they're not getting back to where they were pre-lockdown. And I wonder if you have thoughts on what people's choices might eventually shift to, or what opportunities they may embrace to be more physically active as we go in and out, potentially in and out of these scenarios.
Yeah, well, to me that speaks to being able to do things more locally. So yeah, without a doubt, you get busy, and the ability to be able to cross town to go to the space you would normally be physically active in is diminished. And it's absolutely during level 4 you see a lot more people out walking and cycling, and they're doing that locally, and it's easy to access, isn't it? So I think that's something to consider, particularly if you think about footpaths and roads around where you live, and whether there's access to reserves and tracks and so on, and project that across the city. I think that's for Wellington Council and for the regional council, these are really important things to consider. It's always been that the location that's most used for physical activity, or the locations, are footpaths and roads. So how do you ensure that people can remain active? Make sure there's good footpaths is a good start. But that whole notion of staying local, and I think you can even project that across the the whole country. Like, as a really interesting effect of not being able to travel overseas is that New Zealanders are traveling around New Zealand a lot more, and you talk to the Department of Conservation and in the there over summer they had a hugely busy summer, and bookings for great walks that would normally get booked out by international visitors all being taken up by New Zealanders. So, we're going local from a domestic tourism perspective, but also I think within a city, if we're going to be physically active, it's more easier to do local to where you live.
Yeah, Andrew, and those three most popular recreation activities, as you alluded to, the Active Rec survey, walking, biking and swimming, you'd think that you'd be able to participate in those at your choosing almost any time, any place. But such is the environment now that's not quite the case. How do you think organisations and people can change their offering or change their thinking around what might need to be offered by way of a service to people that are just wanting to exercise or recreate of their own accord?
Yeah, well, there's tons of really good insights that Sporting Z provide in terms of the type of activities that people want to do. There's the what they do, but also what they want to do. But yeah, you look at those popular activities, and you need a place and space to do it, but often you need equipment and you need skills as well. And I've sort of alluded to the with walking, it's about good footpaths and so on. But an activity like biking, the affordability comes into it to actually be able to to have access to a bike, but skill level as well is interesting. And I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but in terms of the number of kids that know how to ride a bike these days compared to back in the day, it's phenomenally bad. So the focusing in and around skill development, I think needs to be thought through as well. It's pleasing to see that there are a number of programs now that you see within schools around sort of building those fundamental bike skills, and in Wellington we're blessed to have a program like Word, which helps kids learn how to mountain bike, for example. So I think all those sorts of things are really important to ensure that people will have the access to and the ability to do what they want to do when it comes to physical activity.
Yeah, great, thank you. Just going to send a note to Phil Gibbons. And Phil, I'm just wondering, you've heard Raylene and Andrew speak now, and you've been involved in some of the conversations locally. I just wonder what your thoughts and view on some of these topics and issues are.
Yeah, kia ora, Matt, tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā te mihi kia koutou. A couple of things first up, Matt, would be just some uninformed observations, but observations nonetheless. I reckon when we went into Wellington, went into its lockdown period 3 weeks ago or thereabouts, I was confident that the community and our sector went into that lockdown with an increased level of individual resilience. We'd been here before. We knew we could nail this because we nailed it before. But I think as lockdown wore on, I changed my mind around that observation. And I think that the stress levels and the anxiety levels amongst individuals, whether it be an observation I would make of the broader sector or specific organisations, the anxiety and stress levels were higher than what they were in that first lockdown. And again, I think it comes down to one thing amongst many, but the one I'd highlight is that we have a frame of mind that when we go into a lockdown like this as an individual or as a part of a team, that we go into a lockdown with a view of going home and working. Well, actually, my philosophy around this is we're at home trying to work. And there's a very, very subtle difference in that, because a number of people who work in our sector and in our region married couples or partners with young children, and the increased demands that are put on people in that very unnatural environment of us all being home 24/7 is bloody tough. I want to draw back, Matt, to a comment made by Lance Walker when he spoke to this group a couple of weeks ago. And one of the observations he made around all of us as leaders was to ensure that, when we're faced with making a decision, we make the decision. It's not in a time like this that we can afford to dwell on a number of decisions and wait until we got all of the information like we might in a more settled environment. The importance is being able to make those decisions and allow people to get on with it. So that's kind of one of the observations I would share. Another one was around a comment Raylene made today, actually, in that the data we have from the last lockdown would tell us that individuals and whānau become far more active during that enforced lockdown period. But as we heard Raylene say, the challenge is beyond that. The challenge is beyond level 3 and 4. It's when we get into levels 1 and 2. Now, I don't have an answer to how we approach that. But again, that's one of those things that all of us in this sector need to be thinking about, because it is about the future piece. It might be the immediate future, but it's the future of how do we retain those physical activity levels that seem to occur during lockdown. It's interesting, I checked out a couple of things today, and for young people between the age of 15 and 17, the most popular activities post-lockdown last year were running, individual workouts, and basketball. Now, I'm not suggesting there's any secret in behind any of those observations, but I guess that's a carryover from that environment that people have come out of, that lockdown environment. I would make one other observation, Matt, around kind of now and some of the stuff we need to be tending to inside our organisations and inside the sector. And that I think that the pressures on individuals, whether they are volunteers or paid employees in our sector, is immense right now. And we're starting to see anecdotal evidence of the pressures that are being put on people who are inside the organisations that are represented on this call. I think there's a significant risk out there around burnout, not just around the paid workforce, but also around the volunteer workforce. I'm going to make one other comment, Matt, and that's around kind of looking to the future, given that's the theme that we're approaching today around. Having talked to a number of my peers in the sector and a number of my peers in the regional sports trust world, there's a real concern that the financial impact of this lockdown won't really be felt in its true form until next year, 2022. And the reason I say that is that we're seeing that there's been cancellation of events, competitions, and it's bloody difficult to recover from them, particularly if it's mid-season for a particular sport. Organisations have received income for events that in competitions that aren't going to be delivered. There are going to be expenses that, whilst they might have been expensed this financial year, there are going to be a number of expenses that go through to 2022, pushing, I think, that financial pressure beyond the immediate environment of this current financial year into the next financial year. We've started some conversations with some of our partner organisations in the sector to see what evidence there is to support this. But I have a real fear that whilst we know that clubs, regional sports organisations, recreation organisations, and other organisations in the physical activity sector are struggling now financially, we've got to be really, really careful that there's not a big bow wave in front of us that's going to pop up come 2022. That's probably enough for me at this stage, Matt.
Yeah, some good points in there, Phil, and especially that cost one, which is something that Andrew mentioned as well. You know, the costs of participating are increasing, and at some point they likely will be passed on. And amongst all the other pressures in the economy at the moment, that could be a real problem down the line. Andrew, I'm going to ask you just for a bit of a sort of a summary or concluding comment, and I'll frame it a little bit. You've got a bit of a futurist sort of hat on or view on typically, but you've got quite an extensive membership of individuals that traverse actually a broad range of sectors. And I just wonder what 2 or 3 or just 1 or 2 of the messages are that you've been sharing with your members that might be relevant to our audience today.
Yeah, well, our strategic plan is reasonably new, and we did quite a big consultation exercise to pull that plan together. And our members told us what their aspirations were for the future, and both from what they're concerned about the future, but also what the opportunities are. And there were kind of 3 main chunks. One was around, not surprisingly, I've spoken about this already, about responding to climate change, and that's not only in terms of the impact that climate change will have on recreation, but also how the recreation sector needs to go about its work. So operating in an environment which will require people to reduce carbon emissions, for example. There was one big area. There's another one around how to ensure that recreation is accessible for all. And, Sport New Zealand have a big focus on tamariki and rangatahi. For our members, it was a lot broader than that, and quite a particular focus in how we ensure that there are good quality experiences for older adults as well. And then the other area was around operating under the principles of te tiriti. So 3 big, broad strategic areas. But at the same time, a lot of our members are very strong in reminding us about the fact that there are, pressures, challenges happening right here and now that they look to us for support on. And given the type of organisation we are, there's a big pressure in and around workforce, for example, and the ensuring that we have people that are appropriately qualified in the industry. That's one big area. And the other one, the right here and now area, would be in around health and safety compliance requirements, and in particular in the outdoor environment. And you have to think here around the regulatory environment around providing adventure activities, for example. So quite a lot, spectrum of things we hear from our members, big picture, and also those sort of here and now pressures as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Really good, really appreciate that. Phil, I've just been scanning some of the comments, questions down the side, and I see Colin's responded to one there. So looks like no more need to refer to that. But last question to you, Phil. The notion of, say Nuku'ora's strategic objections around increasing the level of physical activity, but also well-being is really closely linked to that. And so at this time, what's your sort of message to the physical activity sector around well-being?
Yeah, good question, Matt. Interesting, and I'll highlight it through an example of a piece of work that we're doing at the moment in partnership with the Wairarapa DHB. So the Wairarapa DHB are trying to develop a wellbeing strategy for the Wairarapa, and they realise that there are various components within that. We've been asked to hold the pen and contribute to the role that physical activity has in contributing towards the well-being of the community in the Wairarapa. So we certainly don't see physical activity sitting in and above well-being by any stretch of the imagination. It's well-being will enable, along with other things, that achievement of well-being that so many organisations are talking about in the current environment.
Okay. And so last question for each of you, but Andrew first. Andrew, if you knew that Wellington was going to be going into lockdown next week, what would your advice be?
To the sector?
Yep.
Yeah, so taking up what Phil was saying before, I guess, in terms about looking after yourself. Certainly in my organisation, we made sure we kept connected. Every day we were online as a team, keeping those connections going. It's tough, and it's harder on some than others as well. So I think certainly as thinking about your own organisation first and your own staff. But I think it's also you've got to keep hope up, given that as we've seen, you do swing out of lockdowns, don't you? And making sure you're tapped into the latest information, the latest advice, guidance around how you operate under different alert levels, so that you're ready to hit the ground running, I think. Yep, good. And Phil,
Yeah.
Steer on that question?
Yeah, so 4 things for me, and they're not dissimilar to yours, Andrew. It's about your staff and their whānau. That's number one, clearly in my mind. It's around the sustainability of our own organisation, given the roles, Andrew, that you and I have in leading our respective organisations. I think it's where you can, continuing with your normal deliverables. Some of those are possible, some are not. But the big focus, I think, is where and how do we contribute to enabling our communities and organisations like those that are on our call enable their members and participants to remain active inside what is an entirely different environment. And that comment for me is relevant to whether or not it's levels 2, 3 or 4.
Yeah, I think that we're really in this pressure cooker now. It is the future. There's a lot of new. There's a lot of things we're grappling with, and some of those impact us personally. Some of them impact us just by change of habits and the landscape and environment changing, and it's all a lot of the unknown. And for some, we're making it up as we go, and we're trying to create some clarity around what the big issues are as they're relevant to us, and how we can respond to them. And the way people recreate and participate in sport is clearly changing, and the way organisations design and offer their product and service is clearly up for change. And those are some of the thoughts that we'll have to keep working on as a group and individually. So I'm just going to conclude things there and thank Andrew, thank Phil, and obviously Raylene a little bit earlier for her contribution. This is the 4th collective conversation. We won't be hosting collective conversation next week. We'll be just taking a stopgap, checking in as to whether we take a week off and come back in a fortnight. But as always, the recording for this will be on our website if there's something of interest that you want to share with your colleagues. And any of the questions that we haven't responded to down the side, we will be seeking responses to them and sharing them back with the audience. So thanks everybody, thanks for your involvement, and good luck to you all. May level 2 continue, and hopefully we'll move beyond that. Oh, Colin, you want to stop me from ending the meeting?
I do. I just wanted to add a comment. There was a question about Class 4 gaming, which I think is important to acknowledge. Look, the evidence shows at the moment that Class 4 gaming, obviously there's always connotations attached to it, but actually certainly at the moment there's no evidence that Class 4 gaming is declining in terms of funds that are available for the community. But as we've kind of touched on today, there are broader issues now which are also attracting Class 4 investment, so to speak. So that's the challenge for the sector. So it probably is around, and this is no easy fix obviously, but it is around the value proposition that our sector provides to the social well-being of communities that maybe helps to tick the box a bit more effectively. But certainly the funds are still there. It's just that they've been spread more thinly.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. And so, yep, we are. As organisations and people involved in the sector, we're certainly forced to look at how we do things, and responding a little bit differently in the future is going to be just the way of life. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Look forward to continuing the conversation with you and catching you around, hopefully without a face mask on, very soon. Thanks everybody.
Kia ora, thanks Matt.